Thank you for coming. I'm Lynette Clementson. I'm the director of Wallace House here at the University of Michigan. We have two programs, the Knight Wallace Fellowships for Journalists, which is a residential program here at the university. We bring 18 to 20 accomplished journalists here every year for a break from their daily work as journalists and a year of immersive study here at the university. And we have another program, the Livingston Awards for Young Journalists, which is a prestigious journalism award. We give 3 prizes every year, one for excellence in local reporting, one for excellence in national reporting, and one for international reporting. And it's the Livingston Awards that brings us here today. For the past several years, we've been bringing one of the winners of our Livingston Awards here to Ann Arbor to do an event with the Ford School for Public Policy, who are excellent partners for us. One of the things that we feel about our mission is that in addition to doing things for journalists at Wallace House, that we spend a part of our time doing public events and engaging people in the journalism that the reporters associated with our program are doing. In this time when we're being flooded with news and information all the time, and we are a lot of times looking down at our phones, at our tablets, at screens, at cable TV, instead of at one another, that we want to try to create experiences where we're using excellent pieces of journalism to have people pull up and engage in conversations together, oftentimes very difficult conversations, and to really get to the depth and nuance of what reporters are doing. And so we are here today to talk about an issue that is tied to our International Livingston Award winner last year. In 2017, Christina Goldbaum was an independent journalist working in Mogadishu, Somalia. She was there at a time when stories about conflicts in Africa had faded from the news cycle, and no major news organization had a correspondent based in Somalia. Christina was determined to find a way to stay there, and in an effort to get around the exorbitant prices that foreigners were being charged to stay in Somalia, she did something extraordinary. She negotiated a deal to rent a small, white storage container, just big enough to fit a single bed, a storage container with a leaky roof, but a safe enough place for her to stay. It was inside the green zone and would provide her access for 3 months. That is where she lived and she worked from, so she could stay on the ground in Somalia. Her on-the-ground reporting there provided essential details about the U.S. military presence in the country. Christina's meticulous work won her the 2017 Livingston Award for International Reporting. She won for a series she wrote for the Daily Beast, in which she pieced together details of a deadly U.S. Special Forces raid on a farm. The residents of that farm were believed to be members of al-Shabaab. The U.S. defended the attack even after hundreds of Somalis disputed the U.S. account and demanded justice and an official apology from the U.S. for the massacre of 10 innocent civilians that they said were killed by U.S. troops. That raid on August 25th, 2017, became the most controversial operation in the country since the infamous Black Hawk Down incident in 1993. Since Christina broke that story, she has moved back to the United States. She is now a reporter for the New York Times covering immigration issues. And U.S. reporting from Somalia remains quite minimal, even though U.S. airstrikes there have increased markedly in recent years. Today, we want to step back and discuss U.S. policy in the region and the implications for a policy that's centered more around defense than diplomacy. We'll also talk about what news organizations are covering and what they're missing in the country. And of course, our overarching goal with all of our events is to try to develop a deeper understanding of news stories we read and often don't have a chance to talk about. Our partner today, as I've mentioned, is the Ford School for Public Policy and the Ford School's International Policy Center. So to lead our discussion today, I'm going to turn over the conversation to John Ciorciari. He's director of the International Policy Center here. And we want you to be involved and engaged in this conversation to help people get a grounding in the issues. We had slides running as you were coming in to sit down that just provided some basic facts about our military presence in Somalia. And when you all came in, you should have received question cards. There will be people in the aisles from Wallace House who will be collecting those cards during the event. As you have questions, please write them down. If you just hold your hand up with a card, someone will come and collect it. And this event is also being live streamed today. So for those of you following us via live stream, we ask you to please submit your questions using the hashtag #PolicyTalks. We have Knight Wallace Fellows following the engagement on Twitter. We'll be compiling those questions at the end and make sure we get a good combination of engagement from the room and from live stream. Our Knight Wallace Fellow, Catherine Mackey, will be the person collecting the questions. Kath, if you could just raise a hand. And we'll be posing them to the panel. So with that, I will turn things over to John, and he's going to introduce our panelists and get us going. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you very much, Lynette. I'd first like to join you in welcoming Christina here to the Ford School as a Livingston Award winner. And I also have the pleasure of introducing Bronwyn Bruton. Bronwyn is Director of Programs and Studies and also Deputy Director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. She's an internationally known authority on Somalia and the Horn of Africa more generally. You can find her work regularly appearing in publications including Foreign Affairs, New York Times, Foreign Policy, and others. She's also regularly speaking to people like Christina and being quoted in publications like The Times, the International Herald Tribune, BBC, and many others. Bronwyn has lectured at many leading universities, but interestingly also has lectured often to official organizations, including the National Defense University, including the African Command, and other U.S. military organizations. She's held fellowships at the Council on Foreign Relations, at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and also has a lot of policy experience herself in the region, having worked for first the Government Accountability Office, and then later for USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy. And so we've got a fantastic pair of people to learn from today about what's happening in and around Somalia involving U.S. military efforts and the more general challenges that face the country. If I may, what I'd like to start by doing, Christina, is to allow you to elaborate a little bit on the story that Lynette referenced that was a basis for your award recipients, and that is to walk us through a little bit what you saw from that little white storage container when you arrived in Somalia as the only Western journalist, and what led you to the fact-finding surrounding your expose, if you will, of the raid on the farm in Somalia.
Sure. Hey, guys. So I had been a journalist based in Nairobi for a couple of years when, at the beginning of 2017, I decided to try to base myself in Mogadishu. As you said, there weren't any foreign correspondents there. This is kind of a trend we've seen in the region. A lot of times you'll see somebody whose byline will say they are the Africa bureau chief or the Africa correspondent. That usually means they are probably the only staffer for whatever paper in that region. And at the beginning of 2017, two things were happening. First, Trump had come into office. It had become very clear to journalists that it was going to be a lot harder to get folks interested in stories from the continent. And at the same time, I had started hearing from sources that it seemed like DoD was kind of reinvesting in Somalia. Between, I think it was October 2016 and then into March or April of 2017, there went from being 50 boots on the ground to 500. In March also, Trump expanded or designated some parts of Somalia an area of active hostilities. There started to be talks about loosening up the Obama-era guidelines for drone strikes. It seemed like there was going to be a lot of news to be reporting when it came to U.S. foreign policy in Somalia. So I moved into my little storage container, and 3 months later, I upgraded to an actual room. And started, doing some reporting a bit on the U.S. military, but also, on famine that was happening and other things going on in Somalia. And, as any journalists here know, kind of sourcing up amongst the folks who are in Moog. And then in August 2017, there was a raid in a small town called Buriray in southern Somalia. It's an area that's relatively close to Mogadishu. The region is called Lower Shabelle. It's where you see a lot of U.S. drone strikes today. And afterwards, something happened that I had never seen, happen in Somalia in the time that I had been living there, and the time before that when I'd been reporting on the country in sporadic trips, which is that sometimes you'd hear about an airstrike or you'd hear about ground operation, and there would be some maybe activity on Twitter or some news from locals saying that perhaps there was a civilian casualty. Maybe that was just al-Shabaab propaganda. No one really knew. After this operation, there was this massive outcry from Somalis in the neighboring region, the neighboring town called Afgoy. They had this massive protest a few days later. Hundreds of people came to the town demanding accountability for the operation that happened. Even within the Green Zone, it became apparent that this was something different, at least. So for a journalist, it was a good jumping off point that this is something that is worthy of looking into. So I began investigating, and in the months of doing this investigation, what I found was that there is this town called Buriray is near an area that has a river and is very strategically important for al-Shabaab. They had been using it as kind of the staging ground for VBIED attacks or car bomb attacks in Mogadishu, which, when I first moved there was probably a car bomb every week or every other week in the city. And they had this kind of network of small towns that was under their control in Lower Shabelle that they were using to build these car bombs and then bring them into the city. They would, usually wait a week or two or however long, and then, that car bomb would go off outside of a hotel or government building. And so a team of Navy SEALs who was in the country at the time decided that what they wanted to do was retake this particular town and the surrounding area, basically kind of targeting this Mogadishu attack network. It was also a very lucrative area for al-Shabaab to gain taxes because there were a lot of farmers. It was near fertile, river water. And so they first approached somebody in the peacekeeping mission, the Ugandan contingent commander, asking, "Hey, we want to, retake this particular area. Can you, lend us some of your soldiers, lend us some of your equipment?" He, who understood the context of this particular place where there is a lot of clan conflict, it's very difficult to get reliable information because of the clan conflicts going on at the time between two very powerful clans, declined that request. So instead what they did is went in with some Somali National Army soldiers who happened to not be trained by the US. The US is training some Somali National Army soldiers. These folks had not been trained by the US. And after retaking this particular town called Buriray and setting up for outposts there, they decided to kind of spoke out from that hub in Buriray town. And in the course of doing so, attacked, went on an operation to attack who they thought were al-Shabaab militants on a nearby farm, but who turned out to be civilians. Those civilians had tried in the week after the Americans and the Somali National Army soldiers had retaken the town to approach them, say, here's who we are civilians. We do have some old AK-47s on our farm. We use them to defend the farm against other clan militias, against warthogs. This is something you see very commonly in Somalia. It's a pastoralist country. You have pastoralists who are protecting their animals from rival clan militias and have carried kind of these old AKs for ages. And instead, they were rebuffed by the Somali National Army commander who was, in charge of those soldiers and who did not pass that information along to the Americans. Basically, it became very clear that the American soldiers had, these Navy SEALs had not taken information both from, the peacekeepers, from other sources on the ground who were trying to warn them about the clan conflict that was going on, that some of the Somali National Army soldiers were involved in that clan conflict, were passing on bad intelligence because they had vested interests in working with a particular clan militia who was fighting those particular farmers. And afterwards, in the course of that fallout, there was a Somali government-led investigation into the incident that found that these were civilians. That report, in my reporting, I found was buried under pressure from folks in the American mission. And the Americans to this day will hold that there were no civilians killed in this particular incident. It's also worth noting that, AFRICOM says that there have been no civilians killed at all in any drone strike in recent years in Somalia. And so, again, in that is what I found in the course of this investigation. There's now an ongoing, AFRICOM investigation into the incident that's been ongoing for the past, year or so, and we still haven't heard anything in terms of any outcome from that. My Somali sources have not been spoken to, but that is kind of where we are.
Okay. I mean, thank you for that, and certainly embedded in that story are a whole bunch of themes that are relevant to what we study here at the Ford School. You've got questions, of course, about the role of transparency and secrecy and media access and coverage of these incidents, and broader public and policy awareness of the expanding U.S. military presence in that part of the world. We've got questions about what makes U.S. and allied efforts to combat groups like al-Shabaab effective, what makes it lawful, what makes it legitimate, what makes it ethical. We've also got, of course, questions about how to best advance security, stability, prosperity, and general human welfare in a country that's been racked by conflict. I just want to point out for the audience a few of the references that Christina made. I mean, you've got this embattled government in Mogadishu protected by an international peacekeeping force, and most of the country, of course, either controlled by al-Shabaab or subject to different sort of clan rivalries that you referred to, and so a country in which much of the population is in a highly insecure state, famine, difficulties delivering aid, really a kitchen sink of challenges for the Somali population and for the authorities who are nominally entrusted with governing the state. And I wanted then to ask Bronwyn if you could walk the audience through a little bit. How do we get here? How do we arrive at the situation where you've got this configuration of forces in the country and a situation in which the U.S. government has decided that the appropriate response to that is to rely increasingly on drone strikes and on special force missions and the like to combat al-Shabaab?
Sure. Thank you for having me here. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I'm so grateful to be here with Christina, whose work on Somalia has made such an impact. I want to call out a recent story in the New York Times a couple of days ago, which I think was very directly the child of Christina's research over the last few years, and it's done a remarkable job of bringing attention to what the University of Michigan is rightly calling out as an underreported problem. You've referenced the Black Hawk Down incident, which everyone, even in this day and age, and there are many, many times when I'll make a cultural reference to my colleagues at the Atlantic Council, like jumping the shark, for example. They have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. But when you talk about Black Hawk Down, everyone knows what the Black Hawk Down incident was. It's an episode that's deeply embedded in the American consciousness. And it occurred in 1993. On October 4th, in fact, after the U.S. had accidentally killed a large number of Somali clan leaders. The American public doesn't know about that. It was left out of the movie that was made, probably not surprisingly. But essentially, when a Black Hawk Down helicopter crashed, the Somali people, in their outrage, took out their anger on these soldiers, and they dismembered bodies, and they hung up corpses of soldiers. And it's an imagery that has stayed in the American consciousness. And it's deeply influenced how we've seen Somalia and how we've started to interact with the country. After the terrorist attacks of 9/11, U.S. attention almost immediately turned to Somalia. Because there had been a long, deep fear among U.S. policymakers that its ungoverned space, it had been an anarchy since 1991, would become a host, a security threat to the United States because it would be used by al-Qaeda to launch attacks in the region. In reality, there is very little reason for this fear. There had been many attempts by al-Qaeda over the previous decade to gain a foothold in Somalia, and they had failed quite miserably because the Somalis themselves were simply inhospitable to radical foreign ideologies and to foreigners in general. But the U.S. didn't realize that. And so they tried hard to get together with other regional powers, particularly Kenya and Ethiopia, to create a government for Somalia that could control the territory and reduce the threat that al-Qaeda would find a home there. The effort backfired spectacularly, as one would probably expect nowadays. The government was rejected by the Somali people. It spent the first years of its life in Nairobi. When it finally gained a foothold in Somalia, a radical group called Al-Shabaab emerged from the shadows and started targeting government officials. Instead of U.S. policymakers observing this development and saying, this is a backlash, perhaps we should step back, of course they doubled down. And effectively, the CIA began targeting warlords in Mogadishu. That, again, increased public outrage. Eventually, the warlords were kicked out of the country, out of Mogadishu, and a group called the Union of Islamic Courts, which was an ad hoc collection of Sharia courts in Mogadishu, took power. Not because they were particularly beloved or effective, but because they were really the only organized entity on the ground that could assume that role in the absence of the warlords. This caused Ethiopia to panic because it had been subjected to assaults by Somalia in the past. And it persuaded policymakers in Washington, D.C. that this Union of Islamic Courts was actually being run by al-Qaeda. It was not. But American policymakers fell for the claim hook, line, and sinker, and they green-lighted and provided logistic support and financial support to an invasion of Somalia by Ethiopia. That invasion was horrifically brutal, and the subsequent occupation was horrifically brutal. It not only was characterized by rape, murder, and mayhem, it also motivated a significant number of Somalis who lived in the United States to go back to Somalia to fight against the Ethiopian occupation, which was the worst possible outcome for policymakers, because these people possessed American passports. If they became trained and radicalized, they could return, and they could launch attacks here in the U.S., which is the thing that American government officials have feared most. Al-Shabaab, which had been a disliked and radical fringe portion of the Union of Islamic Courts, was the only entity that was left standing after the Ethiopian invasion, and it became a national movement, a national resistance movement that was targeted against the Ethiopian occupying army and then against African Union peacekeepers who were sent in to replace the Ethiopians. Over the years, Al-Shabaab has grown rapidly from a small contingent of young men, many of whom were legitimately radicalized, into what is effectively the governing authority in Somalia. We describe it as an insurgency, which is absurd because it controls far more territory than the government. And unlike the government, it delivers services, it delivers humanitarian relief, it collects taxes, and it has a monopoly of force in the areas that it controls. The U.S. government response to Al-Shabaab has always been problematic, but it used to be very different. And I do want to take a moment to talk about how that response has evolved. On October 4th, the anniversary of the Black Hawk Down incident in 2013, there was a raid on a town called Baraway, a beachfront town in Somalia, which is also an important hub for Al-Shabaab. The Navy SEAL Team 6 launched a pre-dawn attack on a compound in an effort to capture an Al-Shabaab mastermind named Ikramah. When they reached the compound, they were discovered, there was a firefight, but more significantly, they saw a large number of women and children in the compound. And when they discovered a compound full of women and children, they aborted the mission. It's a remarkable decision for SEAL Team 6 to abort a mission, and it caused some embarrassment to them in the American press. But the reality was it was one of the proudest and smartest moments of U.S. intervention in Somalia. They had excellent reasons for aborting the mission. Because in 2013, I think, from my own vantage point in Washington, that the U.S. understood that it wasn't really fighting Al-Shabaab, that there are many, many enemies in Somalia, and among them is corruption, and particularly impunity. All of the actors in the Somali conflict, especially the Somali government, but the African Union peacekeepers, the Ethiopian army, and Al-Shabaab, have slaughtered civilians with complete impunity. And in 2013, it was the policy of the Obama administration to not behave like the other actors in Somalia. and instead, in an effort to win hearts and minds, to try to rise above and set a different example. It was also the case in 2013 that the individuals who were controlling al-Shabaab were largely not Somali. Al-Shabaab had indeed received a large amount of support from al-Qaeda. It had received jihadi tourists who had flooded to Somalia in an effort to take part in the fighting that was taking place. And it was the effort of the U.S. government, the goal of the U.S. government, to make Somalis understand that the U.S. government were their partner in this effort to defeat these parasites, these foreign parasites who had come to Somalia in an effort to spread chaos and radical ideologies that were foreign to the Somalis. It was the policy of the U.S. government not to mow down innocent Somalis as they were pursuing this fight against al-Qaeda. And it was vital that they do that because they had understood, the U.S. government had understood from experiments in Afghanistan and other parts of the Middle East, that when you mow down civilians, you do harm. You promote radicalization, you make enemies, and you become embroiled in local conflicts that are not the business of the U.S. government. 5 years later, we have completely forgotten that lesson. If SEAL Team 6 were to launch that attack today, there is no chance that they would abort it in an effort to save women and children's lives. I cannot see it happening. On the back of Christina's reporting, on the back of other incidents in which the U.S. has been shown to have killed civilians with abandon, it's clear that we are no longer treating al-Shabaab as a foreign force. We are treating al-Shabaab as a Somali force that's embraced by the Somali people, and we've begun to regard the Somalis themselves as the enemies. And it's led, I think, to this policy that we observe within the Trump administration of a constant tempo of airstrikes, in which the effort is not to wipe out particular high-value targets, because certainly there aren't any left in Somalia at this point, or individuals even who may harm U.S. interests, but in fact to target the largest gathering of al-Shabaab soldiers that can be found. And this is without regard to the potential for radicalizing the living family members of these individuals. It's without regard to the fact that a majority of al-Shabaab fighters are minors, are children. A majority of al-Shabaab fighters are individuals who have been forcefully conscripted, particularly conscripted from minority populations in these riverine territories, farmers who have absolutely no possibility of resisting their conscription. That is to say, they're probably not literate. They're certainly not the enemies of the United States. They're doing what they do because they have no choice, and the U.S. policy is to collectively punish them and punish their family members. And this is, it's hard to explain how particularly horrible this is, but most certainly what it has resulted in is a policy in Somalia that is spinning absolutely out of control, that has no end in sight. The government that the U.S. has backed, unlike al-Shabaab, which has managed to create a governance model that is fluid and adaptable and will certainly endure long past the lifespan of the Somali government. The U.S. has backed an institution that's had approximately 100,000 soldiers trained for it and has barely 20,000 soldiers that it can call upon in a best-case scenario to defend it. It's a government that's been deemed the most corrupt government in the world. It's a government that cannot control territory and will definitely not survive the withdrawal of peacekeepers, which is frankly imminent. And the response of the U.S. government to this looming catastrophe is not to step back and reinvigorate policy and to negotiate with al-Shabaab and to come up with strategies that might actually resolve problems of impunity and clan conflict and land reform, but frankly to bomb teenagers. Just to bomb teenagers, and they're getting away with it because no one is paying attention.
Thank you both. I want to pick up on this point about the sort of evolution of U.S. policy. Of course, as you referenced, it was a gradual increase of reliance on drone strikes and then an inflection point with Trump's election and an increased frequency of the use of that set of instruments. But I want to ask a more general question about U.S. policy with respect to Somalia, and that is, You go back to 2006, you say, okay, well, the support for the Ethiopian intervention backfired in terms of creating more political space for al-Shabaab to flourish. But now we've got al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab itself, as you mentioned, has been involved in planting car bombs and also committing atrocities against civilians. Many members of the audience have read about the attacks on the mall in Nairobi and other incidents of that kind that go beyond Somalia's borders. Given the fact that al-Shabaab is there and is in fact a de facto governing force in large parts of the country with its own set of dire governance failings, what appropriate role then does U.S. military action play? Are in fact drone strikes weakening al-Shabaab in ways that are useful if they are carried out in a way that is measured and that is in fact targeting senior members of the organization? Would it be more appropriate in your views and your experiences for the United States to pull back and to try to allow Somalia to find its own local political equilibrium?
Well, I can speak a little bit to drone strikes. When I was in Somalia, I was doing a little bit of reporting, both from when the U.S. was only targeting, high-value targets to, in the last couple of months, if you look at the press releases from AFRICOM, as Bronwyn said, they're targeting much larger groups of al-Shabaab fighters. So in the time when the U.S. was mostly focusing on high-value targets, I was hearing from recent defectors and others that it had some degree of like a tactical level disruptive effect, where it was making life for the leaders of the organization more difficult. They're having difficulty communicating with one another because they're afraid of using cell phones. So instead, they had to communicate in these various cells across the country with couriers and handwritten notes. So that obviously slows down the process of, say, planning attacks or even just being in communication with one another. And they're also becoming more and more afraid of moving because some people in their leadership had been hit in cars moving from one town to another. So it was making, at least life for the leadership more difficult. They started sending more and more of their foot soldiers out of Lower Shabelle, where a lot of the strikes had been occurring further north into other towns that they hadn't been in before. And so it's having some kind of effect. I think al-Shabaab is a very versatile organization, and it's very adaptable. And so I think what we've seen time and time again is, in these kind of evolutions of policy is that oftentimes, maybe immediately, if we had in like November 2016, I think there was, 5 or 6 drone strikes in the course of 3 weeks. And so that had made life very difficult at that time. But again, what we've seen over and over again is that the group then adapted and adjusted. It sent its foot soldiers out of the areas being targeted. It found these ways of communicating that they weren't as afraid of being targeted that way, and found ways to adapt to that. And so even if those drone strikes at that time were having that kind of, again, tactical level disruptive effect, it's not the same thing as having a strategic effect on the organization, or hitting its funding or trying to say, hey, here's an organization that controls vast swaths of territory in rural areas. Maybe it's time to bring them to the negotiating table, because as we've heard Waldhauser say many times, the idea of increasing the air campaign is to eventually weaken the group to be able to negotiate with them, but we haven't seen the other side of that coin yet. And now, again, in the last couple of months, as you've seen, more press releases that are, where we're seeing 20 or 30 people killed in these airstrikes, it can be concerning because since 2014, the group has had a lot of difficulty getting ideological recruits. And so around 2014, 2015, 2016, what al-Shabaab started to do is going to clan elders in various parts of the country and saying, hey, every family that you have in this small town, you're going to give us one of the kids from that family. We're going to put them in our school. They have started these kind of hardline Islamic schools trying to indoctrinate much younger people so that when they grow up, in a couple of years, they can become foot soldiers for al-Shabaab. So if we're seeing more and more airstrikes that are targeting larger groups of people, as Bronwyn said, the risk is that the foot soldiers killed in those drone strikes are actually these, young teenagers, if that, whose families will get the information from al-Shabaab that their child was killed in an American drone strike. And then what is the long-term impact of that? And, I think, as you've said, people are not, asking, on the American side, we're not asking those sorts of long-term questions. I've always found this kind of inertia in Somalia policy where, since 2017, it's been easier to conduct drone strikes there. There's not the same level of, high-level interagency vetting before each strike of intelligence. And because we are able, the U.S. is able to then conduct these airstrikes, we do. We assume that it's having this kind of disruptive effect that will be constant, not necessarily recognizing that al-Shabaab will find ways to adapt if there are more drone strikes. And then no one really questions whether or not it's still effective in a couple months or, what the next step then should be. And as you said, also the Somali government is no stronger today than it was a couple of years ago. And we're not seeing the same kind of investment in ensuring that there is a strong Somali state or looking at how we can engage in the Somali state. Al-Shabaab taxes the people that are under, its control in the areas in which it controls. It has very heavy presence in, rural cities, and then farmers outside of those cities pay taxes to Al-Shabaab. If you are driving down a road between two of those Al-Shabaab controlled towns, you will pay a tax, you will get a receipt, and at the other end of that road, you will show them that you have paid. Here is your receipt, and then no one can ask you for more money. Al-Shabaab will not try to bribe you. You don't have to pay off bribes. In Mogadishu, the Somali government can't collect taxes. There are massive amounts of bribes being paid. The election that they had in 2016, you literally had planes filled with cash landing in rural areas to pay off for seats in parliament. And again, because DoD has such a large presence in Mogadishu, they have this inertia behind a policy, and I'm not sure are really questioning whether it's still effective. That is the American presence that Somalis see. And what they don't see is any kind of engagement in actually trying to create a functioning state or do state building any better than we did in, say, Afghanistan or Iraq.
The only thing that I would add to that is that Al-Shabaab has actually gained territory in the last 2 years since the tempo of drone strikes has increased. And they have also made a point of launching a signature terror strike in Kenya, which they had not done for quite some time. And I think that it was quite obviously intended to show that they still had the capability of doing it. And so the short answer is no, it's not effective. And I think that the head of AFRICOM has effectively acknowledged that recently in congressional testimony. He said he does not expect the airstrikes to destroy al-Shabaab or even significantly degrade them, but we are conducting them anyway.
So let me then turn to the political side of this, because as Lynette framed the entire session about the balance between defense and diplomacy, and implicit in both of your comments is that diplomacy and political considerations need to play a much larger role than they have to date in the way that the United States approaches the situation in Somalia. Both of you have alluded in your comments to clan-based or other sort of local rivalries and conflicts within Somalia that could be the basis for gaining leverage in negotiations with al-Shabaab. What do you see as the main practical impediments to developing that kind of knowledge and competency in a state where it's not an easy operating environment for a journalist or for a policy analyst or for a civilian who's operating on behalf of the U.S. government?
I don't even really know where to start. I guess we had talked about this earlier. I mean, even just generally, I think the State Department has had a difficult time in the last 20 years. In the last 2.5 years, that's certainly been the case as well. In Somalia, you saw, like in other parts of the world, this kind of mass exodus of the folks who've been working at state and really knew Somalia well, who felt very disempowered. And so the reason they felt disempowered, I should say, is that you would have these meetings in Mogadishu where they would happen at Villa Somalia, which is the presidential palace. And because folks in the State Department didn't have the resources or security capacity to actually travel and be there, it meant that they weren't in the room when conversations between the president, the prime minister, and folks at DoD were having about state building. And so individually, a lot of really great folks decided to leave. And what that's meant is that conversations around, state building in the country is mostly something that's going on oftentimes between, 30-year-old SEALs and Marines and high-level, Somali government officials. I think you're right. It is an incredibly difficult and complicated theater in which to operate. At the same time, there are folks on the ground. I'm thinking of there are some UN folks who've been there for ages. There are folks like Bronwyn who know the details of clan conflict very, very well. But because they are not in contact with the folks who are in that room in Villa Somalia talking about state building, a lot of that knowledge isn't shared. I think that's generally a kind of big issue when it comes to Somalia, because clan conflicts change on a week-by-week or month-by-month basis. And really, the only actor in the country that's figured out how to leverage that into creating any kind of peace is al-Shabaab. They operate on clan conflict. They utilize clan conflict to gain the allegiances of certain clans, and can recognize the fluidity of how those alliances change. So all to say, I think it's going to probably be a long time before the folks who are in that room talking about either negotiations or state building have the kind of nuanced understanding of how things operate on the ground. And we're not really seeing much of an effort right now, or kind of political buy-in to actually begin to have that conversation.
To be fair, if you look back since 1991, the U.S. has tried hard to solve Somalia's problems. And not only the U.S., but the Life and Peace Institute, the U.K., EU. There have been something like 14 attempts to build a government for Somalia, some of them more serious than others. And there have been fairly serious efforts to come up with a formula, like the 4.5 formula, for example, that allocates power among the clans. Nothing has worked. And if I were giving advice to U.S. policymakers, what I would say is that the U.S. is not the right partner to be trying to build a government in Somalia, or even to be doing conflict resolution in Somalia. Al-Shabaab has succeeded because it's not trying to build a secular government. Somalis don't have very many things in common, despite our impression that they're a homogenous society. They're Muslim, and they have a belief in the Sharia now as a means of emerging from conflict and imposing some kind of law and order, and Al-Shabaab is capitalizing on that. The U.S. can't do that. And when the U.S. tries to build a government, what we do is we have basically ministries in a box that are completely uniform, and we go and we unpackage them, and they look exactly the same. What Al-Shabaab has done is create, as Christina noted, an incredibly fluid structure that adapts depending on the village that it's in. It co-ops clan leaders, it leaves them alone, it coordinates with them. It is as fluid as the clan system itself, and it needs to be. And it's not what the U.S. does. It's simply not what the U.S. does, and we should not be trying. The reality is that what the U.S. is worried about is the idea that Somalia will export disorder, that Al-Shabaab will launch attacks in Kenya, or that Al-Qaeda will use Al-Shabaab to launch attacks throughout the region. And in my opinion, the best way to deal with that threat is to negotiate with Al-Shabaab and to draw a red line that says, you know what, you can have this space in Somalia, but you cannot associate with X, Y, and Z high-value targets, and you can't launch attacks elsewhere, and we'd prefer you not to cut people's heads off. It's a fairly short list of things that we're concerned about. But instead of addressing that directly with the power on the ground, which is Al-Shabaab, the idea has been to launch tens of thousands of troops in the country and build a government, which is just an unnecessary thing to do. And instead of backtracking, the U.S. continues to double down.
I think there's one other thing, so you mentioned 4.5. To note too is that the people that are usually engaged in Mogadishu, like the Somali politicians, these are folks who, there have been 2 elections in the last couple of years. A lot of international partners would say the last election included many more people. It was like 14,000 folks who were voting in a country of 10 million, which was a big deal. And that's a sign of, institution building and democratic progress, even though, again, a lot of those seats were purchased. I think in Mogadishu, part of the problem as well is that there are a lot of folks in the city, a lot of elites or political leaders who have really been benefiting in the kind of period of stagnation, right? So they are getting money from a lot of the foreign aid that's coming in, a lot of the military aid that's coming in. And so I also think on the Somali side, there's not a lot of buy-in from certain high level, people that you would need to buy in to kind of create this political process to actually change the status quo, because they're gaining so much either in money or other resources or an influence from keeping things the way that they are now, which is that Mogadishu is functioning. There are, again, car bombs, once every week or once every 2 weeks. But, the city is not under al-Shabaab control anymore. And so they can kind of get away with saying, look, we're fighting al-Shabaab in the regions. If you're in the city, you're okay. Yes, we're sorry this car bomb happened. But again, there's no real push to change where they are right now, which is just stable enough for things to function, but not just stable enough that things function, but not so stable that the money goes away that's coming in from outside sources.
Thank you very much for all of these insights. I want to now turn to your questions in the audience, and if we may, we'll have some read out to you here.
Hello, hi. I just want to start with one from the audience. Do you really think that it's practical to negotiate with al-Shabaab? It says because the set of beliefs of these people forbid them from any compromise. And the question goes on to use the analogy of the US and the Taliban in Afghanistan, which may drive many moderate Afghans from the country. So back to the question, do you really think that it's practical to negotiate with al-Shabaab?
Nobody has a crystal ball, obviously, but I would say Somalia is not Afghanistan. One of the things that has characterized al-Shabaab is the willingness of its members, even allegedly the most ideologically driven members, to switch sides if it's in their interest to do so. The head of the Kenyan contingent in Jubaland is actually Ahmed Madobe, who was believed to be one of the most hardline al-Shabaab members. He supported al-Qaeda in the 90s. He was proud of his engagement with al-Qaeda, but he very happily went over to the Kenyan side when he had an opportunity to do so. Many of these individuals are highly pragmatic. There is no doubt that some of them are not, and that certainly it will have to continue to be a goal of U.S. policy to weed out and deal with people who are true believers. But I think that those numbers are very, very few in Somalia, and that the vast majority of al-Shabaab's leaders would probably jump at an opportunity to negotiate with the U.S. I think it would be very hard to get them to negotiate with the government, which it doesn't recognize. But it's key at this point to understand that the U.S. cannot maintain the strategy that it has currently. AMISOM, the African Union Peacekeeping Force, is not going to stay in the country. They are on a ticking clock. Uganda is threatening to withdraw now. The plan is to withdraw them by 2020. And when that happens, the government is going to disappear. It's going to dissolve because it can't protect itself. And al-Shabaab will take the field. And we can do that. We can allow that to happen and not have a dialogue with them, or we can allow that to happen and have a dialogue with them. Those are primarily the choices.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think it's important to understand, and as you said, that there's probably a handful of folks in al-Shabaab leadership who are left, who are still kind of ideologically hardliners. Madobe is a regional president in Somalia, again, who was once a feared al-Shabaab leader. There was another defection, I guess it was 2 years ago now, from someone called Robo, who comes from Southwest, again, where a lot of these drone strikes are happening, who defected and even tried to run for a regional presidency seat last year. And I think also, I mean, this has been the kind of, what Waldhauser at least purports is the U.S. strategy. We will weaken al-Shabaab to a point where we can bring them to a negotiating table. And I think the question is, okay, when are we going to decide that now is the time that they are weak enough that we should begin to, or try to engage again? Because clearly, drone strikes plus ground ops does not equal the end of al-Shabaab.
There's a couple of questions along the same line, so I'm going to combine both of them. I should say one's from a UM business student, the other's from a UM graduate student who's also a former Green Beret. Just asking really whether or not you spoke to members of US Special Operations, how you know the process for approving airstrikes, and whether or not you're inferring that US Special Operations have no moral compass.
Sure. So the New York Times has reported a lot on the changes in policy from the presidential policy guidance to PSP, which is what it is under Trump. I don't think that special operators have no moral compass at all. I think that in Somalia, you're rotating in and out either every 3 months or every 6 months into one of the most complex operating environments there is. I have sources who have worked in security in their dirty wars in Latin America, onto Iraq and Afghanistan, who have come to Somalia, who say that it is far more complex than anything else they have ever worked in. And there's very little process of handover when new folks come in, other than these kind of small group of defense contractors who have been there for a couple of years at least, and know the details of certain areas very well. But when it comes to kind of, again, looking at the long term of what happens in 5 or 10 years, if you try to retake this particular area, it gets a lot more complicated. So again, I think that the environment is incredibly complex, and unless you have the right information and know who to trust and have people who have been working there long enough, know the scene well enough, and know which Somalis to trust and work with and who has which allegiances where, it's just immensely difficult to operate in that kind of environment, especially when the presence of the U.S. military is ramped up so rapidly as well. And that's kind of brushing on the surface of some of the complications of working there. So I think, to get to the moral compass issue, yes, I think people have a moral compass. But again, if you're not given the right information and you're not working with the right people and not set up for success, I think it's unsurprising then that some of these ground ops are unsuccessful.
I just want to point out, too, it's not only special forces. This is a significant problem in Somalia, is that special forces are conducting strikes. The CIA is conducting strikes. Our Kenyan partners are conducting strikes. It's possible that people from CJTF-HOA and AFRICOM are also in the mix. And so we don't really know who's doing what. And there isn't a lot of, in fact, it seems deliberately obscure. And so part of the problem is that it's very likely that even the security actors within the U.S. government are not coordinating with each other. And it's effectively a free-for-all. It really feels like a free-for-all. There is no interagency coordination process by which the CIA will communicate with SOCOM and say, hey, we're planning to hit X, Y, and Z. And SOCOM says, oh, well, we're planning to hit A, B, and C, so maybe we should pace it out. They're just doing it. And I have to say, I fully agree with Christina, and I personally have worked with SOCOM. I've written for the Joint Special Operations University. I have a great respect for them. But there is a problem that I hear about repeatedly, which is that many of these soldiers that are stationed in Mogadishu are bored, like desperately bored, and they're stuck in barracks, and it leads them to be adventurous, to be more adventurous than they should, and it aggravates what's always been a kind of a cowboy attitude about Somalia. And I do think that that is leading to risks and decisions that would not be made in another theater.
I think that brings us on really to the next set of questions, which are looking at the future. Bronwyn, you said that the US is not the right partner to state build in Somalia, and you mentioned there have been other attempts, even by the EU, to perform this task. So who do you think is the right partner for Somalia to negotiate with al-Shabaab, and should we be looking at an international coalition?
In my opinion, no. My view is that the Somali people are the only ones who can resolve Somalia's problems. Somalia has been the least threatening to the U.S. and has been the most successful at times when the international community has turned its back on the country. In the late 1990s, for example, in the early 2000s, there was significant progress at a grassroots level on peace building. There were no major incidents in terms of civil warfare. The reality is that the Somalis need to, village by village, resolve their differences, and they're the only ones who can do it. And I primarily see the role of the international community as staying out of the way. I don't know that I represent an international consensus in saying that. But if I had to pick a partner for Somalia, I personally would look to the Gulf states, because the Gulf states have long historical ties to the region and strong trading relationships with the region. And they're far better positioned to understand the kind of relationships that Christina has been talking about. And they're far better positioned to deal with the Somalis without the ideological baggage that the Americans bring because of our fear of Islam.
Christina, there's a question here for you. What kind of security concerns did you face as an American journalist working in Somalia, and how were you received by US forces?
All kinds of security concerns. It's a really difficult place to operate. I think that's part of, other than the expensiveness of it. I mean, again, if you're looking at a hotel in the green zone or, in town that is safe, it's at least $100 to $150 a night. Security, if you are paying for, proper security, is $1,500 a day. Part of the reason when we're talking about oversight in Somalia and accountability, part of the reason there isn't more reporting in the country is that reason exactly, because for both human rights investigators and journalists, it can be incredibly expensive. I, again, had been there a couple of times before I decided to move there, so I had a sense of the country. I'd reported there before. I'd worked with different fixers. I ended up working with an incredible fixer who kind of helped me build out a network of folks that essentially, like, every morning when I was trying to figure out, who I was meeting with, where we were going to meet, and how we were going to get there, it was always a conversation about, okay, can we meet them close enough to the green zone, because there's a couple blocks, from the green zone that are still pretty safe. Can we meet them there, because then we can take a normal car and that gets transport out of the way. If not, if we have to go further, whose armored vehicle or security team can we use to get there? I was always dressed, in a full abaya, everything, and if, we ever ended up in a hotel that was a bit outside the green zone and we weren't sure of people around us, I would be the nice Turkish lady who was very, well received and wouldn't say anything, and that's kind of how I operated. But it's a concern that when I was there was a German nurse who was working with ICRC who was kidnapped. Again, car bombs were always a concern. You usually have meetings with folks, especially Somali politicians, in these big hotels in the city that are often the targets of car bombs and complex attacks. So it was very concerning. How was I received by the U.S. And the U.S. mission? I don't like to talk about sourcing for obvious reasons. There are some people who were great to speak with and were very understanding that the country and all of the actors, that's the U.S., Gulf states, the Brits, the EU, there's so many international actors in the country, needed some kind of accountability, and so they helped me out a lot, and I'm very grateful for that. And others, obviously, after some of my reporting came out, were not as happy with me, but that's usually the role of being a journalist.
Can I interject another question about this security, alternatives to the current security architecture in the country? As both of you have mentioned, tremendous corruption in the government, and therefore an investment in the status quo on those who are reaping the rewards of siphoning off aid, and also pent-up hostilities among certain groups given the sort of locking in of certain correlations of forces in the country connected to the U.S. military presence. And so one can say, oh, look at Somaliland, maybe the future of Somalia would look brighter if it were to achieve a more local solution. But the process between what we have today and an eventual sort of reestablishment of equilibrium could be a very, very gory one in a society in which these somewhat perverse structures have been able to develop. I wonder if you could offer us some brief comments on how the international community could follow your policy suggestion that Bronwyn laid out in a way that would minimize the risk of a bloodletting.
For me, part of that, a lot of that actually is coordination. Even, let's look at the Somali National Army. You have Qatar training troops, you have the US training troops, you have the Saudis training troops, you have the Brits training troops. There is very little communication except for between the Brits and the Americans about how they're training the army of this country. And again, once AMISOM leaves, which it will because there isn't infinite funding for a peacekeeping force that has often done more than just peacekeeping, there's going to be a huge security vacuum. And so until you get kind of all of the actors to actually talk, about what it is that they're doing, there's no way that the country will have a functioning army in the next, 10 or 20 years. And again, a lot of those conversations just do not happen in the same room. There's a big conference in the UK, once a year, once every 2 years, you talk about the security architecture, which is great on paper. But then in practice, Qatar is training 3,000 Somalis in Qatar to supposedly go back to the country and join the national army, and they talked to practically no one about that. So again, without any kind of coordination, you're not going to see a functioning security architecture that's going to be needed once AMISOM leaves, and when the foreign military presence does too. If AMISOM leaves the green zone, then it's going to be up to the Americans or someone else to be able to fortify the airport, because they're the ones currently doing so. And also, they have FOBs across the country. If they leave, then that will be al-Shabaab controlled.
I think history is often instructive, and I would have to say that in 1994, which was before my time, but I studied it intensively, and I have to say that one of the things that stands out from that period was that there was a lot of fear on the part of the U.S. that when they pulled out of Somalia, there was going to be another civil war and a massive bloodletting. And the reality was there was about 2 or 3 days of fighting as people grabbed all the things that the U.S. had left behind, and then everything was, back to normal. Likewise, in 2008, when the Ethiopian forces dramatically reduced their footprint in Mogadishu, there was a lot of fear there was going to be a big bloodletting. There wasn't. I really feel that if the African Union peacekeepers were not in Mogadishu and if the government had collapsed, there isn't very much for al-Shabaab to target. So you don't really know what they would be fighting over. And I think that probably my guess would be that once again, we're getting more upset than the situation actually merits. I'd be really surprised to see more than a few days of disorder.
I've got a question here from Twitter. It's about US policy, and I think it's a question you could probably debate for several hours, but we'll have a go. Is the US military presence in Horn of Africa anti-terrorism or neo-colonialism, and how do you draw the line?
Or can we say both? Yeah, I don't know how to characterize the U.S. presence in Somalia because I'm always bewildered by it. My view is that I don't understand why we're there. I've always felt that way, and I think it's fear-driven, and I don't really know how to characterize it any other way except just driven by a fear that the U.S. has had of Somalia since 1993. And I'm sorry to dodge it. But I'm going to have to dodge it.
Probably going to do the same. And I think the U.S. presence in Somalia is interesting in part because the only international attacks other than one in Uganda that al-Shabaab has carried out was in Kenya. There were 3. There was the Westgate Mall attack. There was an attack on a university. And then there was the latest attack a few weeks ago. And the only reason that those international attacks happened is because both Kenya and Uganda are part of AMISOM, are part of the peacekeeping mission, which is why they're a target of al-Shabaab. I think I used to joke with Somali friends that Somalis are very nationalistic in a way, despite the clan conflict. And a lot of my Somali friends would say that Somalis are very proud, think that they are the best country in the universe, not even just in the Horn of Africa. And that kind of joking, we're joking about that ideology, but in a way I think that's infiltrated into the Shabaab as well, in that the Shabaab has to my knowledge, I think to most people who studied the organization, no desire to carry out an attack on U.S. soil. I think that fear tends to come from the idea that there is a large Somali American community in the U.S., and that what would happen if some of those Somalis who had been resettled here went back, joined al-Shabaab, and then came back to the U.S. And carried out a terrorist attack in the country. A lot of the American Somalis, or there weren't that many of them, but the few who went to join al-Shabaab were treated terribly. They were constantly watched. Shabaab soldiers didn't trust them because they viewed them more as American than as Somali. And a lot tried to leave because they were treated so terribly. If you look at ISIS in the north of Somalia and Puntland, a lot of those people are defectors from al-Shabaab who felt like they were foreigners who joined to join the jihad, and they were treated terribly by Somalis who wouldn't respect them as part of their Somali jihad, and so they left. So why we're there is an interesting question because the organization really doesn't pose, in my opinion at least, much of a threat, if any, to this country.
Can I add one thing to that on the imperialism aspect of the question? I think Bronwyn laid out earlier very well, that there are some places in the world where imposing a system of governance that looks like what Western liberal societies use is going to be extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. And in Somalia, clearly successive efforts at that had failed. Several years ago, a bunch of donors ganged up and tried to convince the Somali government to let them share management over certain revenues that were coming in because so much of it was being siphoned off by corrupt officials. The Somali government rejected that, but it was an indication of how far the donors were willing to go in doing things that violate conventional state sovereignty in the interest of trying to prop up this very brittle state modeled after a set of Western institutions that just have struggled to root in that particular society.
There's a question about media coverage. How has US media coverage of Somalia and al-Shabaab hindered or helped the world understanding of the war in that country and the al-Shabaab conflict and terrorism? And there's a particular point about some controversial publication of some gruesome images of shooting victims in Nairobi a few months ago by the New York Times.
Yeah, I can take that. There's very little coverage of Somalia. If you kind of look back over what's been published in the last couple of years, every time, or not every time even, sometimes when there is an attack in Mogadishu, the wires will cover it, maybe BBC will cover it. That's kind of it. There aren't many people, since, probably in the last 5 or 10 years, very few journalists have spent a significant amount of time there. So you'll get the occasional, in the last couple of years at least, report that says, look, the US is increasing its airstrikes in Somalia, give a little bit of history of Somalia, and that tends to really be it. Again, that's part of the difficulty of reporting there. It's part of the difficulty of confirming civilian casualties there, because you're talking about, airstrikes and ground ops that are happening in al-Shabaab controlled territory, so that isn't being reported on. And I think the result is that there's the same kind of general idea of Somalia, the failed country, and a terrorist organization that is there, and that's pretty much it, right? Like, that's probably, if you talk to most Americans, their understanding of the country in the Horn of Africa. Even though it's much more complex than that. I mean, Somalia was embroiled in the Gulf conflict. There was little reporting on that. There's been this kind of war where we're trying to get control over ports in the country, because for many countries, like China, like Gulf countries, it can be a really strategic area, a really strategic country to have a foothold in. Eric Prince has tried to get involved in Somalia. You haven't heard a lot about that. And so I think all to say there is a ton of reporting that isn't happening, but at the same time, it's not just Somalia. In the last 2.5 years, there's been a lot of stuff going on in Africa that hasn't been reported on, because our media environment right now is very American-centric. So that is a big issue. What was the second part of that question?
The second part of it was about the controversial
Nairobi.
images published by the New York Times.
Sure.
Was the Times right to do that?
So for anyone who doesn't know, there was an attack in Nairobi a few weeks ago by al-Shabaab. It was on it was on a building that I know very well. It's a small restaurant. There are offices there. A lot of expat organizations have their offices in that building. Al-Shabaab carried out an attack. It lasted, I think, maybe a day, probably not even that long, because American help did come because after Westgate happened, Kenyans were convinced that they wanted to be the ones to flush out al-Shabaab from Westgate, which is part of the reason it lasted 4 days, and there were so many casualties. During this attack, the Americans helped, and it lasted far shorter. The New York Times published an image that was of 3 of the casualties, 3 civilians who were killed in this attack. They were sitting at these 3 different tables on the ground floor of what is a restaurant in this building. Their faces weren't identifiable. And that tends to be the standard for photos published in the international media or in any media when there are civilians who are killed in some kind of terrorist attack. If the image is deemed not too gruesome for any public, and the individual would not be identifiable by their family members or by anyone who knew them. So obviously if you showed somebody's face, and if their family hadn't known that they were there and killed, that would be very problematic. So typically the standard is that you want, if the individual is not identifiable, if it isn't too gruesome, then we can publish that image. The Times got into a lot of trouble because in the reporting of this story, we did publish an image, that particular image of 3 people who had been killed, And the Times stood by the decision to publish that photo. Again, I've worked in East Africa for a long time. Before I worked at the New York Times, I worked a lot of wires. When the Garissa University attack happened, a lot of the images that I filed were not published because they were deemed too gruesome. And I can say for other journalists who covered that attack, it was really frustrating because here was this horrible thing happening at the hands of, this terrible terrorist organization. And oftentimes I think journalists whose work is not put out because it's deemed too gruesome, you feel like it's being sanitized a bit for the public, and that can be really frustrating. Again, the Times decided to publish that photo. It does adhere to the standards of what we usually go with. And when a lot of the feedback came back that you wouldn't publish the same kind of image if it was an image, from a school shooting in the US, I think what folks maybe don't understand is that in a place like Kenya, if there's an ongoing terrorist attack, as a photographer, you can get into that building. The Kenyan police force, the Kenyan military who's there will let you in to photograph. You can get that image, and then your editors can decide whether or not it's appropriate to publish. In the US, that obviously doesn't happen. So that photo typically would not be taken. And in the few examples where something like that has been, like in the Las Vegas shooting, the Times at least has published those images as well.
How has US policy changed with the switch of US presidents, especially given Donald Trump's views of African countries? I think that might be a reference to a rather derogatory term he used to refer to immigrants from Haiti and other African countries, which I shan't repeat.
I think in this time of deep polarization in the U.S., it's really important to point out that there's been a remarkable consistency in the policy, from starting with Bush, carrying through Obama, and now to the Trump administration. This plan of creating a government for Somalia, backing the government, treating al-Shabaab as a pariah organization that cannot be negotiated with, this is all standard fare. Donald Trump did not create this policy by any stretch of the imagination. And also, to be fair, it was President Obama who dramatically increased the rate of airstrikes in Somalia several years ago. He was extensively criticized for doing it. What I would say is that the Trump administration has loosened the rules of engagement, and as I mentioned earlier, does not seem to be hesitating to strike civilians as collateral damage. Do you have a different view, Christina?
No, I would agree. I think, as one person described it to me, it's been like from having two hands tied behind your back to having one hand tied behind your back. So there is, still a degree of restraint. You could say, Somalia is not, the Middle East. But yeah, I think this has been a pretty consistent change that we've seen, or a pretty consistent policy that we've seen from the Bush administration. It's just when you now have one hand not tied behind your back, that's when we've seen this kind of massive increase in both airstrikes and ground ops.
Thanks. We have time for one more question.
So I guess this looks to the future as well. Given the vast humanitarian crisis occurring in Somalia, should the US just leave it to the Somalians or their Arab partners to address?
That's an interesting question. I think it's difficult right now, I would say, because Somalia has become, the Somali government and security forces have become increasingly dependent upon US support. So it's hard for me right now to imagine a scenario in which the US completely pulls out all of its resources. Even in like the most practical of ways, where when you have folks on advise and assist missions, if you didn't have an American helicopter, the Somali National Army or DNAB, the special forces that the Americans are training, would not be able to carry out that operation. So it's become so entangled now that I find it really difficult to even imagine a scenario in which the U.S. can leave and you still have at least a functioning army if you're looking at the kind of basis of what provides for a functioning state. At the same time, as you said, Gulf countries understand Somalia far more. They have been involved in the country for a long time. It's been complicated given the Gulf crisis, but I think if you talk to a lot of Somali politicians, they would say that they have very strong partners in the Saudis and in Qatar and in countries that there is this kind of greater degree of inherent trust. I think that if we ever get to a point where Somali citizens and Somali politicians are so wary of the Americans, then then yeah, it could be a good strategy to just leave completely. But also, again, practically right now, you have a Somali president who's also an American citizen. And that's, I think a lot of people have pointed to that as part of the reason that we've seen these very close ties between the current government and the Americans as well.
I really think it's important to emphasize here it's something that Christina mentioned earlier, which is that when you drive from one Shabab-controlled town to another, you get a receipt from one person, and you show it at the end, and that's it, you're done. There's no corruption, there's no bribery. And the same holds true for humanitarian relief. Al-Shabaab has frequently cooperated with the U.S. or with the United Nations in the distribution of humanitarian relief, and when it has, it's generally worked much better than the coordination with the Somali government. I've heard story on story from UN security officers who have worked with the then transitional federal government or Somalia government to deliver food. And as soon as the truck comes up, basically they describe hordes of Somalis descending on them, the Somali soldiers firing in the air to prevent them from running off with everything, Somali soldiers stealing the humanitarian relief. And conversely, describing experiences with al-Shabaab, where they go up to the town, people are waiting in a line, there's 2 Shabaab soldiers there, they're not armed, and everybody goes up one at a time to take exactly their allotment and then go home. And so we should not be thinking about this situation as an either or. Again, it's really the refusal of the Americans in particular, but the UN and the EU and the international coalition in general, to refuse to regard al-Shabaab as a potential partner, as an organization whose worst tendencies could potentially be mitigated through collaboration with the international community, instead of a pariah organization that's basically out to get the United States, which I think we know is not the case.
With there, we're going to bring it to a close, and I just want to thank Bronwyn and Christina and John for an excellent job moderating a really complex conversation. And I think there are probably a lot of people in this room who are here because you follow international news. And I think it was so refreshing today to spend this much time on a topic that we may see a couple of columns every few months in a newspaper about, and then not much else. And Christina, I think, mentioned, our coverage here in the United States, and I think Kath would say the same about England right now, is very domestic. And not even domestic. Our coverage in the United States is very Washington-centric, and it's very focused on a couple of people in a couple of buildings in Washington. And so to be able to pull out and have this kind of substantive conversation about something that we should understand, because as Christina and Bronwyn point out so well, there are real long-term effects of how we handle this situation over the coming years. And I just want to thank you for a very wonderful conversation, and for you, the audience, both in the room and for the people following on Twitter, for very thoughtful questions. I think we'll have some time afterward for a little bit of conversation here up front in the room, but I want to focus on ending on time. And I think some of you that are here we see frequently at our Wallace House events. And so I want to thank you for coming out for these sorts of conversations that are rooted in journalism and that really take seriously depth and reporting and facts and nuance. And our partnership with the Ford School is so important to us. And we do hold this event every year where we bring a Livingston winner here and pair with policy experts at the Ford School. And so I hope that we will see you, even if you came today because this is your topical interest, that we'll see you in future years for this annual event. I also want to remind you about some upcoming Wallace House events. Next week, next Tuesday, March 19th, we will be at Rackham Auditorium on a very different topic. Ronan Farrow and Ken Aletta of The New Yorker are coming for an event called The Weinstein Effect, Breaking the Stories That Spurred a Movement. And Ronan Farrow, as you may know, was one of a couple of reporters who broke the story about Harvey Weinstein's longstanding abuse, and something that had been an open secret in Hollywood, but what Ronan was able to do was to get people to go on the record. And Ronan and two reporters at the New York Times, Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey, in breaking that story, really did something incredible. Because so much in our society has changed because of those stories and the Me Too movement that started around the energy that was focused on those stories. And so we'll be at Rackham Auditorium next Tuesday night for that event. And on the following Tuesday, which is March 26th, we will be upstairs in the amphitheater, the smaller space in Rackham, for another one of our annual events, the Eisendrath Symposium on International Reporting. Charles Eisendrath, who's here in the front row, if you could just stand just briefly and wave.
Thank you all.
Charles is a significant figure for us because he is the former director of Wallace House and ran the program for 30 years. And in developing the program, Charles really baked into the DNA of what Wallace House does a really keen focus on the importance of international reporting. And so when he retired in 2016 and I became director, we wanted to make sure that people understood that that part of our mission is important to us. And so we have this annual event now every year that carries the name Eisendrath. And this year, on March 26th, we'll be in the Rackham Amphitheater talking about the threat to global press freedom. And I think those of you who follow press freedom issues know that that it's become more dangerous for journalists in the United States and around the world. And we want to have a conversation about why that is and how we can be thinking about it and doing things about it. Yes, Charles?
Just to thank the audience for coming to this, and I hope we'll see you at the symposium. I couldn't be prouder that focus on international news is in my name, and couldn't be happier that Lynette is carrying it forward.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank all of you, and we will see you soon.